I'll call it a complex subject, and the idea for this session came from, yeah, well, just days and days of trying to figure this out myself, how actually to govern workspace item and data access in Microsoft Fabric. There are so many nuances, so many gotcha moments, so many things that it's really difficult to get like a consolidated overview of all of the documentation for this topic. So I've done my best to try and put it into one presentation and a little bit of live demoing. Admittedly, there will be a lot of slides here, but I hope you'll leave this session with a more thorough understanding of different paradigms for sharing access to stuff in general in Fabric. Full disclosure, the session doesn't cover everything, right? It focuses especially on access from the point of view of using Fabric as a data platform for serving data to end users through Power BI, and also through direct access to the backend data with SQL and Python. But it's not like we're not going to cover notebook permissions. We're not going to cover user data function permissions. We're not going to, like, all that kind of stuff. It's going to be primarily lakehouses and semantic models. That's the focus here, but through different paradigms of access. Very briefly about me, my name is Jon, or John, if that's easier for any of you English speakers. I'm a consultant with Inspire, a Danish-based data consultancy. I recently got the Fabric MVP award back in January, so I didn't have to stay up late waiting for my renewal that took place the last week, if you've been seeing all kinds of posts on LinkedIn. But I do write my blog at Downhill Data if you want to check out some of the stuff I'm talking about today, or a lot of other Fabric and Power BI related topics. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn or come join. So just to give you guys the quick rundown of the agenda for today, we're going to do like a super brief 2-minute security concepts introduction, also to, again, just dial in what are we focusing on today and what are we not focusing on. We're gonna spend 5-10 minutes looking at different roles and permissions, and I'm gonna try and take those bits and pieces from the documentation and put them in a nice, concise presentation for you to hopefully absorb. But admittedly, there's a lot. And then we go more into practicality mode and discuss what are then actually different governance strategies, governance paradigms that you can use. We'll tackle a bunch of different scenarios and how can you, within each of these paradigms, assign people the correct amount of permissions. And I have some best practice tips for you at the end as well. So that's where we are. For the very brief security introduction in general, and we are definitely not gonna cover everything here. I stole this image from Venkatesh, who is on the security team, Fabric security team at Microsoft, and one of the authors of the security white paper. And he used this slide for a presentation he did at Data Platform Next Step a month ago, and I thought it was really excellent. It just showcases how, in general, the first level of access that a user will be facing when it's accessing Fabric is the platform level access, the Entra ID conditional access or private link authentication. Your user is going to put in their credentials, they're going to log in. If you're on a private link, it's going to check whether you're on the right network and everything, right? That kind of very basic network level security almost. We're not going to cover that today. Next level is there's not a whole lot of options there yet, but it seems there's more in the pipeline. But on a domain level within Fabric, if any of you are working with a domain metadata artifact in Fabric, there are specific configurations you can do there, especially regarding default sensitivity labels and stuff like that. We're also not going to cover that today. Where it's at today is at the workspace level, at the compute level, and the item level. We're going to have a look at what are the different accesses we can grant on a workspace level. We're going to talk about what are the different accesses we can grant on item level, and what are the different types of accesses we can grant all the way down at an engine level, at a compute level. And spoiler alert, what you are going to get today is a snapshot of what it looks like today, but things will change in the future. We already know about features in preview and things on the roadmap that are not here yet. So the best practices you're going to be given today is sort of, a snapshot at the state of the development of Fabric, just full disclosure. Right. So with that out of the way, I hope it's clear that where we are moving today is within the workspace compute and item level of Fabric security as a whole. So to get down to it, and this is going to get a little hairy the next 5-10 minutes, right? Some of it will be maybe slightly boring, but it sets the foundational knowledge you'll need to understand all of the permission scenarios later today. So if we don't cover this, we are losing somebody behind. The first place to start is with workspace roles. And I think all of you on this call, if you're working with Power BI or working with Microsoft Fabric, you likely have a grasp of what workspace roles they do. There are 4 roles: admin, member, contributor, and viewer, and they are by far the easiest, fastest way to start sharing content on Fabric with other users, right? If you go ahead and create a workspace yourself, you become the administrator. You have full rights to do anything in your workspace. You can view, modify, share, manage everything, manage everybody's permissions, kick people out, all of that stuff. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the viewer who can only view content but cannot modify anything. And then in between, we have the member and contributor who, well, most notably, they are allowed to create and edit items in your workspace, but members have the distinction from contributor that they can also add other members, give other people that permission. I'm going to go just a little step further with these in a second, but this is just sort of the high-level workspace roles that you, of course, need to understand. If we take it one step deeper, we have item-level permissions. So this would be, and again, now I'm highlighting here the lakehouse and the semantic model because they'll be the recurring main characters of the show today. Item-level permissions for lakehouses and semantic models. When you right-click or go into the settings of a specific item in your workspace and you click share, a pop-up comes up that gives you a bunch of options. And this differs per item. For lakehouses, you get the pop-up you see on the screen here. The first gotcha, I think, for most people is that if you want to just grant somebody read access, so that would be connect permissions that don't grant all kinds of other stuff, you need to leave all checkboxes unchecked. It's very, very satisfying to set a green check mark in all of these boxes when you share Fabric items, and I think most people, they have a tendency to just do that. But the way to just grant pure read access, which allows people to just connect to a lakehouse, see it in the OneLake Explorer, but maybe counterintuitively not see any data at all by default, you need to leave all checkboxes unchecked. And the reason why you might want to do that is not clear to you yet, but it will be when we get to the permission share scenarios. What you need to know is that if you want to grant pure read with no additional permissions, leave all boxes unchecked. Then there are a couple of checkboxes you can check. If you want to give the user access to read all of the data from the SQL analytics endpoint of a lakehouse, you need to grant the read data. That's the read all SQL endpoint data checkbox that you need to check. If you conversely want to grant access to read all the files, the Parquet files in OneLake underneath the lakehouse, you need to grant read all Apache Spark. And if you for some reason want to make use of the default semantic model and only the default semantic model for end users, you can grant them build permissions to allow them to build reports on top of that, if for some reason you wanted to do that. Another super quick gotcha, I think, for lakehouse permissions is to me it's not always that easy to figure out where to assign these read data and read all permissions. I thought I'll just super quickly show you here, right? I have a workspace demo permission testing. I have a lakehouse. If I click share on this lakehouse, I can go ahead and assign all of these 3. This is the screenshot you saw above. A little bit of a quirk, I think, is if you then go into let's say I actually assign my other account here some permissions. Let's go ahead and actually give it both of these. Don't want to notify myself, grant it. If I then go into manage the permissions of this workspace, which is an excellent interface where I can manage this, I see that the user has read and read all. But if you noticed, I was a little fast before. I actually gave the user read data as well. And if I go back into my workspace and now click on the SQL Analytics endpoint for the Lakehouse and go into Manage Permissions, then I can see that the user has read data, and read all. It's super unintuitive and makes it really hard to get that unified view of what permissions does a user have. But I'm just mentioning this to tell you that you need to use the manage permissions view on both the Lakehouse object itself and the SQL Analytics endpoint if you don't want any nasty surprises. You can assign both permissions to both places from the common share view here, but you can only remove read data again if you go into SQL Analytics endpoint. Weird quirk. Now you know. The build permission stuff for this one we won't talk too much about. So that's sort of Lakehouse item permissions 101. The next level, and why I mentioned before we're going to return to the workspace roles, is that all of these item permissions, well, the way that workspace roles they work, is through the way they give read and create possibilities, is that they actually implicitly grant users item permissions. So if you go ahead, user viewer access to a workspace, they implicitly get read and read data on your Lakehouse, which has huge implications for the way that we can govern and structure our items. If you're not aware of this, you might think that granting, if you're used to just the old Power BI paradigm, where maybe you're splitting up Power BI reports and semantic models, and you grant a user viewer access on a workspace because they just need to see the report workspace, need to see the reports in there. Well, if for some reason you are storing Lakehouse's models, reports in the same place, and you think that, oh, I can grant viewer to my users, they'll just be able to see the report. They can't open and edit my semantic model, and they can't do it on the Lakehouse either. Well, you're wrong, because they get read data on the Lakehouse. They can consume all of the data inside of your Lakehouse if you grant them just the viewer access. That's the only sort of difficult part about the workspace roles and permissions on Lakehouses. It's that the viewer role is overly permissive. If you ask me, I would at least say so. Contributor, member, admin, they all kind of make sense. As soon as you're a contributor in a workspace, you can delete the entire Lakehouse. You can read all of data circumventing any kind of security you set up. That's the name of the game when you're using workspace roles, and frankly, there's no way around it when we discuss permissions that creators of items they need. When you're in a workspace and need somebody to create something, they will get access to all of what's in that workspace. Strategies for that as well. It's about workspace separation, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so that was a couple of first gotchas, right? Just to recap, what I think is important here, if you want to remove read data access after granting it, you need to go specifically on the SQL Analytics endpoint. That's good to know. Secondly, if you're thinking about using viewer workspace accesses, know that it implicitly grants read data on Lakehouses. Also a little bit of a gotcha. And actually, since we were already in the habit of showing stuff live here, right? Let's just go ahead and remove the accesses that I gave my other account a second ago. So now when I check the manage permissions, it says that I have just read here. Go ahead and remove everything, I guess. If I go in here, remove access altogether. And if I go into the workspace and I now add it as a workspace role there as a viewer, you will see that it automatically propagates accesses into the permissions on the specific item. So I just removed this a second ago, right? And now it's back. Read and read data on the SQL Analytics endpoint. If I go into the Lakehouse itself, it should only say read. Okay, and view output, sure. But you cannot go access all the files and stuff like that. All right, those were Lakehouse item permissions. Semantic model item permissions. Kind of same story. When you click share on a semantic model, you get this pop-up. If you don't check any boxes at all, the user will just get read access, which means that if you have a Power BI report connecting to a semantic, any semantic model, be it the import or direct query or DirectLake, they will get access to the model itself. Depending on your storage mode, it doesn't mean that they can see data, but they get access to the model itself. If you check the boxes to allow recipients to modify, you give them write access as one of the few items where you can explicitly declare write access specifically on the item. Notice we couldn't do that on the Lakehouse. If you want recipients to share the model, you can grant reshare. And if you want recipients to build additional content themselves, you can grant build on that. And just to sort of give the story again, if you grant workspace role access to a workspace, what item level permissions does that translate to for semantic models? Not as many gotchas and surprises here. And I think maybe that's because most of us have been used to working with Power BI for such a long time. But at least I wasn't surprised looking into this. It works as it always has. Viewers, they do not get elevated permissions to see all the stuff behind the semantic model. They can just consume reports built with the semantic model. Contributors, they can, of course, edit and overwrite because they can do that with all artifacts. And then the one difference otherwise, right, is that contributors cannot reshare semantic models on behalf of the model creator, if that's the only role that you have. If you are the creator of a semantic model and you're a contributor, you can of course reshare. That's another bullet here. So that's item permissions in general. Okay, I get exactly 30 minutes before my PowerPoint will shut down. So that's great. Thank you, Microsoft. Good thing that I only have 30 minutes left of the presentation. Just a quick note, summary, viewer role, what's in the details. It automatically gives read on everything and read data on the Lakehouse. Workspace viewers can technically see all data in a semantic model if there is no role level security on it, but they cannot just connect and consume the semantic model without connecting through something else. For example, a report created by somebody with elevated permissions. Can a workspace viewer see all data in a semantic model with role level security defined? No. They can only see whatever the role level security role allows them to see. Can a workspace viewer see all data in a Lakehouse? Yes, but only through the SQL Analytics endpoint because they get the read data role. Then they explicitly grant them read all. They can also see the files. Can a workspace viewer see all data in a Lakehouse if SQL granular permissions limits access? Yes, but we'll get back to that in a second with the granular permissions, the compute permissions we'll talk about in a second. Quick note on build permissions, because there are a lot of rumors, I think, about what do build permissions allow people to do. In general, they just allow you to build new content from the semantic model and find content that uses the semantic model. You can build composite models, pull data into Excel, query from XML, see hidden data fields, but crucially, build permissions do not violate row level security. If you have row level security on a semantic model, you grant build permissions to somebody, they can only see whatever data the row level security role allows them to. If they're not a part of a row level security role, they can see nothing at all. If they're part of a role that has a filter to dynamically filter for items that are allocated to said user, well, they can build a full report, seeing only the scope of data that they are allowed to see, share it with a bunch of other users who might see entirely different data when they open that report. It's a very powerful feature. So it's just to get that out of the way, that build permissions are harmless as long as you remember your row level security. If you don't have row level security on a semantic model and you grant build access, well, that's where you have the trouble. If you've relied on sort of granting people read access and then only exposing a small subset of your data in reports, and then you suddenly grant build to somebody, then they can see the entire model behind, all of the data, all of the fields. Workspace app permissions, just to get that one, it's just another way of distributing item level permissions. You'll see this box when you're sharing a Workspace app. You can allow people to share the data set in this app that grants, a reshare. There's the build checkbox, and if you don't check any of them, you just get read on the semantic model. So these are just shortcuts to grant accesses that you would otherwise do on the semantic model itself. And row level security still applies. You still need, even if you grant read on the semantic model, you still need to explicitly add people to the row level security rules as well. And all of what you see here also is exactly the same if you try to share a report directly with users. So Workspace apps and reports are just shortcuts into granting item level permissions. And when you've checked these boxes and clicked share, you'll be able to see the people in the list in manage permissions. You can see which people you've granted what accesses, remove them again, all that stuff. So you don't need to be super afraid of, I think my point with these slides here were, don't be too afraid about build permissions as long as you use row-level security or your data is not sensitive. And if you're worried about, there's 4 different places I can grant access as well, in the end, everything just grants you item-level permissions. Some of it is just bundled into Workspace roles or into quick share windows in reports and Workspace apps. All right, there's a lot of information here. I hope you'll stay with me for the last sort of topic here, which is the compute permissions, the granular permissions. Then we're ready to go to the different scenarios. So there are 3 different flavors of granular permissions. We have row-level security and semantic models. I won't spend as much time on that today, assuming that that's likely one you're more familiar with than others. At least there's a lot of great articles out there about it. There's also SQL granular permissions in the SQL endpoint. And then there's OneLake data access roles on the files part of the lakehouse. Preview feature, which in the future will be replaced by OneLake security. We'll talk about that in a second too. Importantly, granular permissions do not apply to admins, members, and contributors. Their Workspace roles override any kind of granular permissions you set. They do, however, apply to viewers and to users with item-level read and build permissions. So that's what you can use them for. Somebody on the call who's not muted, I believe, but hopefully we can sort that out. All right, SQL granular permissions, what does that even mean? Well, SQL granular permissions is, just like sharing access on a Azure database in the SQL Analytics endpoint of your lakehouse or in a warehouse. You can grant object level and row level access through grant, revoke, deny, or through functions and security policies. Good to know here is that if you use SQL granular permissions, you cannot use DirectLake with single sign-on. This will change a little bit when we move to the new DirectLake paradigm that connects to OneLake files, but that's another discussion. Just know that currently, if you want to use single sign-on to authenticate to a lakehouse, a SQL Analytics endpoint, and use DirectLake, it can't work. There's a way around with fixed identities, but that's another workaround we'll get back to. Row-level security applies to Workspace viewers and people with read and build, as we established before. When applied, only users who are allocated to at least one role will be able to see anything at all, unless they, of course, have Workspace contributor, member, admin. And then here's the point for DirectLake models. It's advised to use fixed identities, as users otherwise need read data on the lakehouse to avoid fallback to direct query. The short version of that is just that DirectLake doesn't support SQL granular permissions. So you can't make any restrictions on the lakehouse level for DirectLake semantic models. If you want to make restrictions on DirectLake semantic models, you need to build them as row-level security in the semantic model. OneLake data access roles, the files equivalent on securing granular permissions in the lakehouse. There's a GUI for setting up roles where you can give object level access, currently only object, not row level, to specific tables and file folders in your lakehouse. What you need to know here is that if a user has read data access roles, so there's read data and read all. If you have read all, you can see all files in the lakehouse. If you only have read, you can see no files at all. But if you have read plus data access roles that gives you access to specific tables, you can see the files that just corresponds to those tables specifically. If a user has read all, then you can use data access roles to actually negate specific tables from their from what they can see, as long as you remember to delete this default reader role that is auto created when you create these in the first place. Full disclosure, I don't like this feature. It's in preview and will likely never GA. OneLake security that is coming is going to be much better. There are some previews, some blogs that detail a little more about OneLake security that you should check out. That's going to be the future of lakehouse access controls, and we'll also simplify things on the SQL endpoint side of things. Basically, the promise is one place to define security for all engines. So you don't have to make security both in your semantic model and your SQL Analytics endpoint and on the files endpoint for the lakehouse. Right now, it's a mess, and that's why there's even an idea in doing a session like this at a conference. In the future, we can narrow down the scope of that session a lot more. Whew. This is how I feel after 20 minutes of rambling about concepts that you need to know just to be able to understand the permission scenarios I'm going to show you now. I I hope you're not too overwhelmed either. We will revisit all of these in due time in one way or another. What I want to do now is to outline you. Well, there are three basic governance strategies that corresponds to each of the three different sharing paradigms we just discussed. And then I want to talk you through some very specific permission and sharing scenarios and some best practices that you can take advantage of. So, I mean, in general, you could have a policy to say, I always and only want to use workspace roles. I don't want to use any item permissions. And you'll be able to get quite far. It's by far the easiest way to set up your sharing, your permissions, your accesses in Fabric, but it's also the most permissive setup. Often users are allowed to see a little more than they need. And if security is a concern, you'll see a huge multiplication in number of workspaces because you really need to segregate what items do you place in which workspaces, because you're very quickly granting people read access to everything in a workspace, right? But it's also a very transparent setup. You only ever need to check what permissions people have on the workspace level. Then there are what I call unrestricted item permissions. That's the whole read all, read data, build, those kind of permissions. When you stick to always granting item level permissions, it's more tedious than staying to workspace roles. You can accidentally grant access to more than users need. For example, granting read data to a lakehouse lets people see everything. So if there's data in that lakehouse that somebody shouldn't see, well, then you need to split up into multiple lakehouses. So item multiplication may be required if security is a concern. And then there is the restricted item permissions, where we go all the way down to the compute level. And in addition to item permissions, put the SQL granular permissions, the one-leg data access roles, the role of security on there. And that's where, we get the most control, the most restrictive access, but it's also both the least transparent setup. Viewing accesses requires you to dive into both item permissions and all the way down on the engine level. You need to write queries to check which SQL granular permission policies are in place to see what accesses people have. It's not easy to get an overview, and it's also a huge amount of work to set up and maintain. At least some of it you can code your way out of if it's the SQL Analytics endpoint part, right? But I mean, you've all tried maintaining row-level security. It's not always easy, right? But taking these three different access strategies, well, if we have several different permission scenarios, what are different ways that we can then use those? So the first scenario I want to just take you through here is we have some end users who want to consume data straight from a lakehouse. Namely, we have a user who wants to do that through SQL, and we have another user who wants to do that through Python. What does that look like from each paradigm? Well, from a workspace strategy point of view, we need to grant the end user viewer access for them to consume data with SQL. Why is that enough? Because it implicitly grants them read data on the SQL Analytics endpoint, and they can see all of the data there. For the Lakehouse files, the Python part, viewer is not enough. If we want to get by with a workspace role, we need to grant them contributor access to the workspace, because the viewer role does not grant read all. And this is the first place it becomes apparent, right, that the workspace role strategy quickly gives users too much access unless you're very careful, right? Because in this case, you're elevating a user to the permission of contributor, allowing them to essentially delete everything inside of your workspace just because they needed to be able to query something from the lakehouse via Python. I mean, it's not necessarily a problem. I'm just flagging it, right? Then there is if you just go for the item level permission strategy, you can also, instead of granting the workspace viewer role, you can give the user read data to consume data with SQL, or you can give read all instead of the contributor role to let the user consume via Python. And if you want to be the most restrictive possible and not just grant them access to the entire lakehouse, you can use read plus the SQL granular permissions on all tables or the specific tables they need. And for files, for Python, it's read plus one-leg data access roles. Then there is the question of consuming not all but limited data with O-level, object level security, row level security in either paradigm. For the workspace strategy, you'll actually be able to do it halfway with workspace roles, right? You can grant viewer to an access and then use SQL granular permissions to deny permission on specific tables, but it's not truly just a workspace role strategy, right? We're already in a hybrid mode, so I really should have put not possible here as well. And on the Lakehouse part here, it's not possible at all with the workspace strategy because you need to give contributor rights, and contributor overrides any granular permissions that you set. So workspace strategy doesn't really work for sensitive data scenarios here or limiting data. We can't really use it for that. Item level permissions, totally doable. You can, well, again, in combination with granular permissions, right? Read data plus SQL deny can give you control over specific, just very specific tables that the users get to see, and same with one-leg data access roles for Python and read all. And the most restrictive scenario is again using just read and SQL grants, or just read and one-leg data access roles. Whew. Import semantic models and reports. How does that work? So if you want to do a workspace strategy, you can get by with just giving your end user and whatever credentials you're using for refreshing your data source and your model creator viewer access in a workspace, the workspace where the data resides, that is. Because of course, wherever the report or model is created, the model creator will need contributor to be able to create the item. But if we play with the thought that the lakehouse is in one workspace and the model and report is in another, we can get by with granting viewer access to these people in the lakehouse workspace. That's what I mean with this one. Because implicitly they get read data on the lakehouse. And if it's an import model, no single sign-on, we can make the refresh work, and the end users, they just need permissions on the semantic model. If we want to go item permission strategy, well, then we need to set permissions both on the model and on the lakehouse. So if we disregard, again, the workspace strategy, the model creator needs to be an owner of the model, and they need to have read data on the lakehouse in order to be able to build their whole report, right, their model. The data source credentials needed to refresh the model. They don't need, well, you don't assign them permissions on the model itself, but whatever credentials you use needs to have read data on the lakehouse. Again, to refresh the entire import model. The end users, they don't need any permissions on the lakehouse at all. In fact, they just need read on the model itself. And if we go all the way, item permissions, the model permissions are the same story as before, whereas with the lakehouse, we can get by with read and SQL grants as long as we are in import land. So what does it look like with row-level security? Well, if we want to do the workspace part here, workspace strategy, almost the same as before, but you need to also allocate end users a row-level security role on the semantic model. If we want to do an item permission strategy, we need read plus the row-level security role as a difference from before, and the same with the specific granular permissions, read plus row-level security role. So it's almost the same thing. It's just with row-level security roles in the mix. Import with row-level security. Okay, direct query models and reports with row-level security. What does that look like? It's actually the same as import with row-level security in the model as well, except you need to set up data source credentials to not use single sign-on, but use the data source credentials, of course. So the only gotcha here, and I should have highlighted that a little better, that's the beauty of running a session for the first time, but the data source credential that you use for a direct query model is, of course, essential for passing through data, right? You need to make sure that you're not enforcing single sign-on for this to work. Otherwise, your users will need read data access or read plus SQL grants in the lakehouse as well. And I forgot I had a slide that actually explained that, because this is, of course, with row-level security in the model. And this slide does show if we want to put row-level security in the lakehouse, then that's exactly what the user needs. Then they need read data on the lakehouse or read plus SQL grants for the very restricted scenario. And then in this case, if you're using single sign-on and want to connect directly to the lakehouse, then you don't need the data source credentials at all, right? Because we're just using the end user credentials. Apologies for forgetting that I had that slide. That was a little better than me trying to explain it all from one. Now, this is where it gets interesting, and this is where I'll spend the majority of the last time here, because I think most of you are actually more curious about what happens with DirectLake models, because this is where things get incredibly complex, if it wasn't complex enough already. So we have a case here where a user wants to consume reports and models that are built with a direct lake storage mode towards a lakehouse. What does that look like? For a workspace strategy, we can get by with just assigning both end users and model creators viewer access on the workspace of the lakehouse. That's actually sufficient, as long as, of course, again, model and report is created in a separate workspace where the model creator has contributor. If we want to do item level permissions, we need to assign read data to the lakehouse for both the end user and the creator, and on the model, it's the same as before. Now, if we want to do a restricted item level strategy, what's important to note is that, as mentioned way back when, DirectLake breaks if we are using SQL granular permissions. And it's a little confusing. Even though we're using DirectLake, which supposedly reads files from one lake, you need to assign read data permissions on the SQL endpoint to grant access to read data through a DirectLake semantic model. Supposedly this changes in the future, as mentioned earlier, but for now you need to assign read data. And because we cannot restrict our users or we assign granular permissions on the lakehouse for end users, we have to use a fixed identity, or at least that's best practice. And you'll see why that's best practice when we get to the row level security part of things here. A fixed identity, just in short, is the same as data source credentials. It can be a service account, a service principal. It can also just be, in theory, your developer's credentials that is used as a fixed identity. You create a cloud data connection and use that to connect to your backend. It's essentially the same as your refresh credentials in an import model, just for DirectLake models. And what could this look like? Just splitting this a little out on sort of workspaces, right? One way to do this, if you have a workspace strategy, is you'll have one workspace, the lakehouse, with your data, in which the only admins you have will be your workspace admins. Your members and contributors will be lakehouse developers, and then the viewers would be model creators and end users if you're in a workspace role strategy. That you'll have a secondary workspace. You need to create a secondary workspace to avoid giving your model creator, contributor, or member rights in your lakehouse workspace, assuming that they are not the same people. So in the secondary workspace, the model and report developers will have elevated workspace permissions, and the viewers will just be end users. There's an alternative here as well, where we split up the semantic model and report into separate workspaces too, but that's for another time, right? If we do the unrestricted item permission strategy, what does that look like on a workspace level and item level? Well, we never use the viewer permission anymore. Instead, we say the lakehouse workspace, the only people who actually get workspace roles are our lakehouse developers. And then we grant read data for creators and end users in the lakehouse. In workspace 2, we can again elevate our model and report developers to members and contributors. And then on the model itself, we can grant item level permissions for end users, and for our data source credentials, we are just using single sign-on. Then for the granular security, it's almost the same thing. It's just a fixed identity instead of using the end user here. Now things are getting even more complex. We're adding row level security to the mix. How do we do that? It's not possible, at least with row level security in the lakehouse. The only way we can do DirectLake with row level security is to do it in the model itself. The reason being, as mentioned before, SQL granular permissions, which we just established that it's the SQL endpoint that gives you access to use DirectLake. If we try to start restricting that with grants, denies, revokes, DirectLake will default back to direct query. DirectLake will simply break, and then you could have just as well have built your model as a direct query model. So that doesn't work. We can't do it with row level security in the model if we use a fixed identity. And I'm going to speed up a little here because I'm definitely behind on time with all these details. The key to making this work is the fixed identity. So no matter which of these scenarios we are using, we need to set up our semantic model to use a fixed identity which needs to have access on the backend. And in a workspace strategy, it's enough that everybody has viewer access on the Lakehouse workspace, and then a role-level security role for end users. Item level permissions, it's a read data paradigm, and the same with the restricted, with the granular permissions. Just to show you what that looks like workspace-wise, same kind of thing. The only people who get member and contributor rights are the developers of items. And in terms of data access, it's the fixed identity and the model creator who need viewer on the Lakehouse. It's end users and role-level security roles that will grant access to the semantic model itself. This is where I have an alternative that show you can split the model in the report as well, of course. If you want to do item level permissions, again, we restrict workspace permissions to being only developers, and then viewers granted to nobody. And then on the items itself, it's the creator and the fixed identity who need read data. And then the model itself would just grant the end users read access and assign them to a role-level security role. Make sure to share all these slides with you afterwards. And for the granular permissions, it's the same thing as the previous slide, because we are handling the role-level security in the model itself and not on the Lakehouse. So there's no difference there. The final scenario, and I promise this is the last one. Well, what if we want our users to both be able to connect via a DirectLake semantic model with role-level security and consume limited data through SQL? Well, we need to create two lakehouses, because if we grant access to a DirectLake semantic model, we cannot restrict that through SQL granular permissions without breaking DirectLake. So we need a secondary lakehouse where we can define SQL granular permissions to make this work. We don't have time to cover all of this in great detail, so I'll just let you know that it's basically a combination of the two slides we've seen before. You just need to have two different lakehouses where you specify item level permissions. And basically, you cannot do this without item level permissions. It's not fully possible with a workspace only strategy. That's the quick version of that. So what do you do? What do you choose? Which of these paradigms is the best? If we have these three different paradigms, I hope you could see from my slide that reality is there is no one method that will cover all use cases. You need to mix and match. My personal sort of I take on each of these is that workspace roles is only for item creators. I never assign an end user, somebody who just needs to consume either data via SQL from SSMS or Python through a notebook or a report. I never assign them viewer roles. I only give them item level permissions or read and granular permissions. For workspace roles, in addition, you also need to separate into multiple workspaces to segregate different developers. And same thing you might need to do with items to segregate based on your item level permissions. And what I always do is that I try to fit this to whatever workspace strategy I have in place. This is from a customer I worked with a while back where we coined a couple of different paradigms. We had centralized workspaces, decentralized workspaces with sensitive data, and decentralized workspaces with non-sensitive data. And our rule was that for centralized workspaces, we actually never used item level permissions because it was only developers who were accessing these directly. Only workspace roles for all developers. Then what happens is that the developers of the decentral workspaces, they build items in here and share their artifacts with item permissions and granular restrictions when it's sensitive data. And when it's non-sensitive data, we just use item permissions without granular restrictions. That's just one example of trying to mix and match all of these different things.